Thank you very much. There's a lot to do tonight, and we want to have some discussion. So after the lecture, maybe a stretch, I'll be right back to enter the discussion with you and let you ask as many questions as the time will permit. And remember, until there's a dialogue between you and the lecturer, you haven't had a lecture. And if the lecturer doesn't encourage a dialogue, that means you don't encourage difference. It is through understanding the nature of our difference that we grow. Because we discover that we don't differ as much as we think we do. All right, this series is important to me and important, and I've tried to make it important to you. Because there is a need to deal with why there are so many African people outside of Africa. There is a need to understand what happened to African people outside of Africa and understand the contradictions of the African presence in the Caribbean islands and in the United States and in South America. Because the African presence was the motor force that set these nations in motion. And of all of the cultural groups brought to the New World through force or voluntarily, the African group brought the greatest diversity of culture and history. And this is why it became necessary to almost immediately declare war on the concept that the African people had a history and had a culture. All right. The preface to African history in the Americas is an understanding of the hungry need of Europe. I won't dwell on this very often, but I'll be coming back to it because we are still in a bind, a mental bind, because we were made into a new people in the so-called New World. It wasn't new. Now, I'm going to tell an old story that I've told many times, yet it bears retelling. When I came to New York, avid reader, mostly other people's books, and having the fortunate circumstances of working for white people who had good libraries, and they never seemed to read books, so they never seemed to miss them when I took them home. So having read their books, and because I came from a group in the school from what the sociologists call the subculture, and there's no such thing, but the extreme poor. And I was the exception because I was extreme poor and brilliant in the classroom. Now, because of the color gradations, these are things we don't talk about, but we should sooner or later, within the school, generally the kids whose complexion was more related to that of the master got the privileges. And finally, a 5th grade teacher changed the pecking order. She said, no matter what color, who gets his lessons best gets the privileges. And she changed the whole assembly arrangement. And so therefore, now the dark-skinned kids had captured the assembly. And I was the leader of what we called then the Black Brigade. So intending to outdo those middle-class kids, little freaks who wore shoes all the year round and ate 3 meals a day, you know. I decided that I would do something exceptional in the assembly. I would lecture on the African and ancient history. So I go to this white man who got a good library that I have been borrowing from for quite some time and asked for a book on the African and ancient history. And the phraseology of the South of that day, when a white person is not brutal to you, is when he's kind, he let me down slow. He told me, I'm sorry, John, you came for people that have no history. Then I began to search for history, but this is the main point I'm leading to, is that when I came to New York and met Arthur Schomburg and wanted to know the whole history of my people, I was a teenager then, so teenagers do think like this. On his lunch hour, henceforth within the hour, I want to know it all. Tell me the whole story. So he patiently told me to sit down. And he said, son, go study the history of your masters. What you call black history, what you call African history, are the missing pages of world history. Now, because I've now begun to study European history, I began to understand how African history was misplaced in the history of the world. And the one thing that I learned repeatedly, you cannot oppress a historical people. And once a people understand the nature of their role in history, they will not permit themselves to be oppressed. In order to oppress you, people must remove you from the respectful commentary of history. They must destroy your confidence and historical memory. The memory of what you was, so that you can be confused about what you are, and more confused about what you still must be and where you still must go. In essence, this is what happened to us in the 15th and the 16th century. All right. Now, because I've given a course on Africa, I'm not going to dwell on this. But the essential preface to Africans being in the so-called New World was the needs of Europe. Europe had exhausted itself. It had come out of the Middle Ages, of the Dark Ages. The lethargy was disappearing. They had partly recovered from the Crusades. They had lost 1/3 of their population through famines and plagues. They start looking for routes to the east, someplace where they could get some spices and sweets to put on that gosh darn awful European food so they can eat it. All right. The Africans the Arabs and the Berbers were controlling the Mediterranean and had blocked their passage to the greatest trading body of water in the world, the Mediterranean Sea. On the borders of that sea, world trade began. Hannibal passed across. The people came through the front door of Egypt, across that body of water. The amalgams from Asia came across that body of water. A process of domination that still exists started from across that body of water, and that is the physical bastardization of a people, followed by the mental bastardization of a people, making them confused about who they are and what that culture consisted of. All right, the Africans had preserved the sciences of Europe and the world at a university in Spain called Salamanca. The Europeans got that information, especially maritime information taken from China, expanded on it, got a catch of maps made by Jewish gold dealers, because they were they had a monopoly on the gold in inner Africa and in the Mediterranean. Now, Europe is seeing the outer world. She's still heading for Asia. But on her way to Asia, Africa was discovered en route. The initial intention was not Africa. And they had no slavery intent toward African people at first. Now, discovering Africa, its gold, they were still reluctant, because they had come down the coast of West Africa looking for an African emperor named Prestigion, who was a Christian, hoping to recruit him to help them against the so-called infidel Arabs and Africans who had been blocking, the Muslim Africans who had been blocking their route in the Mediterranean. They wanted to once more gain control of the greatest body of water for trade in the world, the Mediterranean Sea. After the decline of Rome, who made a disgrace out of the management of Christianity, Europeans had not controlled that sea. Christianity as a religion, because the Europeans adopted it, Europeanized it, became alien to the Africans who invented it and had it thousands of years before Christ. Now the European is coming out of his bind. He has no sentimental attachment to himself. He has no sentimental attachment to the rest of the world. He is hiding behind the cloak of Christianity, though he was not a Christian then, and he is not a Christian now, and he is mentally and totally incapable of being one. Now, in East Africa, the Arabs have already disgraced Islam. They had started a slave trade 600 years before the Europeans. And this slave trade, after they lost Spain, preying on nations in Africa, had drained Africa of so much time and energy and resources and organization, the Africans now could not mount an offense against Europe. Now we see the enemies that the Arabs that we had installed in Spain and the Mediterranean, because the military arm was African, turning on us. Now this is bigger than my skimpy explanation, because every ally we ever had has turned on us when it was his or her convenient to do so. Left or right, and there is no exception. Now the Arabs have turned on the Africans, moved down from North Africa and destroyed the great nation states in inner Africa. Now they will increase the slave trade along the coast of West Africa, the Portuguese and the Spaniards. Africa is in a bind now. East Africa is controlled by Arab slave traders. North Africa is controlled by Africans and Arabs returning from the conquest of Spain now that they've lost Spain. West Africa is arguing among themselves because they came to settle their family dispute. They will make a mistake by inviting the Portuguese to arbitrate their family dispute. Now, I've said this before, if you didn't learn anything from Godfather 1 and 2, you never, absolutely never invite an outsider to settle a family dispute. Never. Sober up old drunken Uncle Willie. Let him settle it. But it must be somebody from within the family. Now the African is in a bind by the European. Now let us explain something that a whole lot of people have got misconceptions about. Whether the Africans had slavery before the Europeans. In the European sense, no. Servitude is not slavery. They had worse servitude here in the United States, whites against whites. Many times the Africans in wars or difficulties would capture other African groups. These groups would have to work their way out of indenture, either tending cattle or doing something. Some groups built up a surplus of labor. The Africans had no big ships to take from Africans down the coast. So he knew a king further down who needed some labor. Now that the Portuguese are there, he hired some of the Portuguese to take these Africans from one part of Africa and another. And the European is interpreting this as meaning the African was in the slave trade. The African was not in the slave trade, and you let people beat you over the head with nonsense because you have not studied African culture to understand that the nature of African servitude one to the other had no relation to the world. Africans had no ships that he could connect 3 continents. And even if the African was in the slave trade, he could not have brought it off. He didn't have a ship that would hold 100 people along the coast. Mostly big fishing boats and river boats. So he could never have brought off anything as massive as the Western slave trade. Couldn't have done it if he wanted to. Didn't have the facility anyway. I am not saying Africans were right in imprisoning their in holding their prisoners of war and making their prisoners of war work for them. Well, that's better than killing them, but I'm saying that they made a symbolic mistake and a tactical mistake when they hired the Portuguese to take captives from one part of Africa to the other and gave the Portuguese the illusion that they were in the same trade and had the same intentions for enslavement as the Portuguese. That was a mistake. It was a mistake because we did not know the European culture and we did not know the European mentality. Didn't know it then, don't know it now. Otherwise, you would behave differently. The Africans came from a society that was collective. The European came from a society that was individuals. Two kinds of temperaments, two different people. Now in the Western world, you have become selfish, closed-door individuals. You get in your lonely room to think of something to tell your analyst, but if you had some friends, you wouldn't need any analysts. Because African society was so open, if you couldn't talk to anybody else, you can talk to the village gospelist, who was always available. That was a good drain off. But we became a different people in this bind. All right. If the concept of slavery was starting in the world, it was a going concern among the Arabs 600 years before the Europeans, and if there were so many people in the world, why the choice of the African as against those other people, collectively more numerous than the African? The question is both ancient and current. Why is Africa more exploited right now than any other continent? Why do people willing to fight Africans and not willing to fight others? Why does Israel get more aid than all the African nations in the world put together? One nation in the total population of the Jews. The total world population is less than 1/2 of the black population in the United States. Why do they get so much attention, you get so little attention? They got that political thing together, you haven't got yours together. They got their religious thing together and their cultural thing together. Religion and culture are servants of a people, and they convert it to service. With you, religion is religion. You don't make enough demands from anything, especially the people who take up your time and your resources. We are the true believers. We out Muhammad, out Pope to Pope. We believe in things in their purest form. Can't go to the right or the left. They say go to the center, we go to the center. So now we become the victims of our own culture as the needs of Europe began to expand. Now, let's look at the beginning of the tragedy. It began slowly, like most tragedies, almost accidental. They took a few Africans out, took the African to the King of Portugal. The Africans were so well dressed, the King of Portugal thought they were royal to visit him. The Pope gave him presents as it was the custom and sent him home. The concept of slavery had not even gotten across to his mind. He was a Christian Pope, so they sent him to the monastery to pray and relieved him of the job. But Europe was changing now. Europe had once more gained control of the Mediterranean. Now they had learned again what they had lost: longitude and latitude, how to handle ships. Now they were turning these ships into slave trading ships. They did not think that this was a violation of Christianity. In fact, some of the major hymnals in the British Church was composed by slave traders. The hymn, How Sweet the Name of Jesus Sound, was composed by a slave trader waiting on the west coast for a good wind and a good wave so he can take his catch back to the market, They saw no contradiction in exploiting you. As people celebrating the 200 years of the Constitution, and see no contradiction in the fact that the Constitution never applied to you. Don't apply to you now. But you have to understand something about powerful people. Powerful people never have to prove anything. Powerful people never apologize. They don't document anything, they just say it. All right, now, let's deal with some dates, some neglected dates. Let's deal with 1455. Half of Spain has gained its control of itself. And this half of Spain has colonial aspirations, though the Moors and the Africans are still occupying the other half. So they go to the Pope to argue about how to divide up the world and how they are going to treat people once they are in charge. They got ambition. We who are still technically slaves never sit down and discuss with each other behind a closed door, what are we going to do once we become free? We don't talk about it. First, you got to acknowledge the fact you're a slave. You say, okay, then, now what are we going to do about it? Once we throw it off, then how are we going to act? This is not a discussion among us, and it should be a discussion. But what the Portuguese and the Spaniards are talking about now is how they are going to behave once they are in charge. How are they going to treat those other people? And the Pope says, you are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people. So to enslave a person, all you have to declare is that he is an infidel, not a member of your religion. Nothing Christian about it, nothing humane about it. Read Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery. It's all documented there in the first 3 chapters. Now the dirty business is underway, and the rationale, the reason for the European not being guilty has been given to him by the church itself. Now, between the time the Portuguese entered the business in the 1430s, 1438s and thereabouts, to 1492, there was no large slave trade. No large slave trade because there was nothing for a slave to do. There was no plantation system. They tried it at Madeira in the Canary Islands. Didn't work out. To have a large slave trade, you've got to have a large labor market to attract the slaves. So now, we're going to come to something that is terribly misunderstood. What did Christopher Columbus do or did not do? But 10 years before he had visited Ghana with the Portuguese crew that forced their way in the country and set up the first big slave trading force, Elmina of the mines, because they were trading in gold as well as Africa. It's 1482. 1492, he sets out for the so-called New World. Africa is in trouble because Africa's last great nation state is falling. Sangay. Mainly because its emperor, Soni Ali, gets killed coming home from a minor war. A commoner, Muhammad Abubakar Ituri, takes over. He gives it a stimulation that would last for another 100 years. But the great states inside Africa called the Western Sudan, we don't study the large independent states in inner Africa that did not fall with the slave trade, that lasted 200 years after the beginning of the slave trade. These nations are in trouble. They're not falling, but they're now in trouble. But a new line, the Askir dynasty, a lineage, comes to power. Strong African, no-nonsense rulers who managed to keep the slave trade from spreading inland. In the meantime, it's flourishing along the coast. Now you see the need for a large number of slaves with the opening up of the so-called New World, with all the fakery about what Columbus discovered, and discovered absolutely nothing. We now see the need for large labor supply. Plantation system. Now we've got to study the Caribbeans. We're going to come back to the Caribbeans again and again, because we don't understand the Caribbeans don't understand the Caribbeans, and their place in history is not understood, because most of the time it's not written about, and when it is written about well, most of the people don't read the books. But the Caribbeans have a different place in human history and a different place in the history of the African away from home, because the African began in the Caribbean, before South America, before the United States, because the plantation system, a new way of life, started in the Caribbean. And with this new way of life starting, and with the spread of plantation system, with the best plantations in Jamaica and Haiti, now an economic system is developing that's going to save the falling economy of Europe. This is why blacks are minimizing when they start claiming things, because they ain't claiming enough. 1/3 of all the commerce to the so-called New World is coming from Jamaica and Haiti. Now, there is no America at first, at this early stage. There is no United States. There is no British colony. This would come later. There are no slaves in America, black or white, at this time. This would come later. But the Caribbean, the development of the Caribbean plantation system and slavery system would be the backbone of the development and exploitation of the African away from home. And these islands would become holding stations where they break the spirit of the slaves who would eventually be sold in South America and in the United States, when it became the United States. We have to look at the evolvement of a new way of life in the Caribbean islands, the adoption and the resistance to this new way of life, and an advantage that the Caribbean people had then and have now, and never made the full, never took full advantage of. Almost from the beginning, they were the majority in the population. And when you are the majority in the population, though you are a slave, you've got a psychological advantage because you know that one day you will have the land. You know that that minority that's controlling you can't last indefinitely. So the shaping of the Caribbean islands, especially the two islands that produce the largest amount of revenue for Europe, is taking place long before there is a United States. One of the main reasons why the African fitted into this terrible scheme, one of the reasons why Christopher Columbus was told to go to Asia and didn't go, because he had discovered through African sailors that the pickings were better in the so-called New World. And he double-crossed Isabella and changed his routing. Now I'm sorry he didn't go to Asia because they were more sophisticated there politically. They would have wasted him and that would have been the end of that story. The Africans were rather naive politically, kind to strangers, traditionally hospitable to strangers, still are. Nearly always the wrong stranger.
Yeah, sure.
To this very day. Now, because he went to New World and because he didn't go to Asia, he could make claims in that part of the world that he never could have made in Asia. He couldn't say that he discovered anything in Asia. The Chinese would have told him, so where does this food come from? Discovered what? We are the ones who introduced spaghetti to Marco Polo. We're the ones who introduced paper money to the world. We made the 3-decker ship when the Europeans hadn't even made the 1-decker ship so well. This is documented proof. And you wouldn't have pulled that. Not only Asia, you had some sophisticated people over there. The Indians had been conquered by the Iranians. I'm sorry Christopher Columbus didn't go to Asia. It would have been a different world story about the whole concept. But the concept is developing now because the coastal states in West Africa are in trouble, arguing among themselves. And had the Portuguese stayed away 50 years, they would have settled the argument and been strong enough to resist. So when Europe is having all of its arguments, we don't take advantage and go in there and take them over, and we could have. When the Africans conquered Spain, Europe was so poor and weak, all the Africans needed was shoes. Take all Europe. Marched it into France and changed their mind and went on back. So who in the hell wants it? Kind of people we are, kind of temperament we've got. To us, things have to make sense. The European conqueror, sometimes it don't make sense. He kills his own labor supply, and he's physically lazy anyway, so he'd kill the man who's going to serve in his tea. He looks around, kill all his labor supplies because he ain't thinking about it. All right, now, the business is a business. And many of the slaves who were to go to South America originally came from the Caribbean islands. That was the holding station for the whole of the New World for a while. After a while, there was a split between two Portugals. One Portugal serving Brazil and one Portugal serving Lisbon. So you had two Portuguese slave trades. Now you have a direct slave trade between Africa, South America, and Lisbon, and that market. Now you have a change, but you have less of a drain on the Caribbean supply at this juncture, but a development of the Caribbean plantation system. You have something developing also in the Caribbean plantation system that has almost disappeared from the Caribbeans of today. Disappeared by the end of the 19th century. African culture continuity. Because the slave masters in South America and the Caribbean bought in large lots and kept the lots together. So they could speak each other's language, speak each other's drum language, speak each other's tonal language, had some of the same customs. So the people in this area were more distinctly African than those who would eventually end up in the United States. So this is a result of the 200-year turning point in history. The 200-year turning point when the entire world was changed to suit Europe as against the rest of the world. There have been lots of turning points in history. One earlier one was the conference at Nicaea, when the Europeans took a basic African religions, whitened them up, and made a European concept of Christianity. A concept that could enslave people without feeling guilty about it. So when you speak of European Christianity, let's call it European Christianity. But the Christianity that came out of Africa and that existed before Christ had a all-binding spirituality and an all-binding respect for all living things, including the cockroach, including the tree, including the water that flows. Everything that lives got respect. Now the European had created a religion that respects only the people he designated for respect. And he's designating a whole lot of other people for slavery, which is most of the world. Now, using religion as the handmaiden of his worldwide expansion, they're accusing people of not being Christian. When he say you're not Christian in his way of being Christian. He's encroaching more and more on South America and more in the Caribbean. But because the Caribbean people happen to be a majority, because the African people in Brazil happen to be a majority, a series of historical revolts are now being set in motion. The Berbice revolt in Guyana, the revolt at Palmeiras that will bring an entire African country into being in Brazil, another African country at Bahia. Africans are asserting themselves as Africans. Nobody's called Negro, nobody's called colored. These are African people using an African prerogative, still remembering an African culture, which is the cohesive force that holds them together. This revolution in Bahia, in Palmeiras, and in Berbice, all what happened before the American Revolution. Now let's back up a little bit. See if we can start toward the summary, which is impossible considering all the notes before me. Now, 1619. All of this had happened. There have been major revolts in the Caribbean. 2 African states established in South America, Bahia and Palmares. There have been the early Maroon revolts in Jamaica, although the Maroons were all over, including the United States, because the word means runaway. But the most noted of the Maroons were in the United States. That the Maroon revolts before Captain Cocho in Jamaica. All of this had occurred, and the Africans in South America and the Caribbean had asserted themselves as African people and had challenged the entire structure of the new society. All of this had happened before 1619. 1619, the Dutch ship picks up about 20 African people, bring them to Jamestown, Virginia. This is also misunderstood because this was not the beginning of chattel slavery. This was the beginning of a form of indenture for Africans. And when they arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, most of the slaves in America was white and Indian. They arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. They eventually worked their way out of indenture. Remember, you have to work 7 or 10 years and you're free. The first 100 years in the United States was not chattel slavery. The British, who were absentee owners of large plantations, grew tired of buying new slaves every 7 or 10 years. So the concept of chattel slavery was introduced. Now it is introduced in the Caribbean. But something is beginning to appear in the Caribbean that the British not taking properly note of. The British brings over a low class of whites, basically technicians, to fix the sugar mills and do all of this. Because the British are a minority, the white skin is at a premium. And so these whites now have status that they never had. So now you can command respect for everything with a white face. So taking advantage of the women, gambling and drinking, that class of whites really just exhausted themselves. These were the whites who were supposed to keep things going technically. They were not upper class. They were just people, basic fixers of mechanics. Now the Africans in Jamaica and other islands began to learn the same trade and practices. This is the origin of the Caribbean free man. Now you have a spokesman class that's going to demand some relief from the harshness of slavery. Up to this point, slavery in the Caribbean was as hard as slavery could possibly be. But now, because of the laziness of the British technical class, the Africans learned to be the wagon masters, to make the furniture, to fix the sugar mill. And the British would bring over British furniture directly from England. And with that soft wood the furniture was made out of, the termites would eat that furniture for dessert. Now the Africans would look at this piece of furniture and reproduce it. And if you go to some of the big houses in Jamaica today, or any place in the West Indies, you will see some of that furniture. So well made you could put a truck on top of a bed and there would be no damage. Jamaica had good mahogany then. This is before they stripped it and sent most of it to Europe or misused most of it. It hasn't got a good supply now because they've used it up. But Jamaica was a great mahogany producing island. So was Haiti. So the hides from Jamaica, the mahogany from Jamaica, the rum and the syrup from Jamaica, the sugar from Jamaica, gave it an economy that made it a valuable piece of property. And now, with these free men negotiating, they were not slaves now. They had used their skill to negotiate themselves out of slavery. So if a Caribbean person, I'm descendant of free men going back to 200 years, chances are some of them could be telling the truth, because some of them are exaggerating, but some of them could be telling the truth. Because these Caribbean free men go back a long ways to the 1600s. But they were effecting some relief on the harshness of slavery. All of this now, in the black man in the United States, is just beginning. So now, they worked their way out of indenture. Some of them became landowners, and one, lo and behold, became a slaveholder. I'm not proud of him, but as a matter of fact, one Arnold Johnson became a slave owner. If you read a book by Lerone Bennett called The Shaping of Black America, read the first 2 chapters. Read especially the chapter on white servitude. The nature of white slavery in the United States that was so harsh. Many of the white slaves married blacks and was glad to do it. This is before color prejudice set in so tightly. Now what you have to look at, what happened to the development of Africans in the United States between 1619 and the American Revolution, 1776. What happened in that span of time that a whole lot of people have forgotten? First place, the British had eliminated indenture status. And the African became chattel. Many of the whites could work their way out of indenture. Many of the whites worked their way out of indenture and bought that black lover out of slavery. Benjamin Banneker was born out of one of those relationships. The mother, who had a black lover, she got out of indenture, accumulated some money, bought her lover out. They married. Benjamin Banneker is the offspring of their daughter. Now something else is happening that we're going to work on a little later. Now the first of the Caribbean free men are coming to the United States. and hooking up with the free black New Englander. All right, now how did the blacks in New England become free? More about it later, but now the winters were long in New England. So you could only use a slave 6 months a year. But the only way to keep him for the 6 months, you got to support him during the winter months. It wasn't profitable. Had slavery been profitable, slavery would have been just as brutal in New England as it was in the South. Just wasn't profitable. And besides, you had enough poor whites who would do anything, so poor they would do anything. Now you had the beginning of the industrial slave. Slaves who learned to work in mills. Slaves were carpenters, ship's caulkers. You got the beginning of an employment for the black American free man. You got the first contact with the Caribbean free man. And the first contact we have a record of, that Prince Hall came from Barbados, and he began to ask some questions about all these people talking about liberty and justice for all, and whether this meant us. And they told him, in this country, if you're a minister, you get respect. So he became a minister. He didn't get much respect. For your property owner, you get respect. So he began to own some property. Nothing changed. And finally somebody told him, you've got to have an organization. So he went to the British to get a charter, start a Masonic order. The British wouldn't give him a charter, but there was an Irish regiment angry with the British, and they gave him a charter just for spite. And he started the Black Mason. This was the beginning of cooperation between the Caribbean free man, the Black American free man, something both of us have stupidly forgotten about. Neither one of us call ourselves Caribbean or American. Both of us call ourselves Africa. The African connection was firm. This, of course, would lead to other free men coming to the United States. John B. Russwurm from Jamaica, one of the editors of Freedom's Journal. Robert Campbell, another Jamaican. He would accompany the American Martin Delaney in a search for a place, because this the embryo of the settlement of the colonization society had already started. And these were Africans going back to Africa to search for a place to settle for those who wanted to return. So Robert Campbell goes with Delaney. Read Robert Campbell's account. Robert Campbell was a Harvard-educated man. So it's a Harvard man's account. Read Robert Campbell's account. They've both been published in the same book, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor paperback, called Search for a Place. Robert Campbell's essay, Pilgrimage to My Motherland, is one of the most moving and feeling books ever written about the love of a man for the country of his birth. His grammar's off, it's a little rough here and there, but if you can get the feeling this man gets across, that rough hew essay, it towers over Delaney's essay, not because it's well written, it's because it's not well written. But it's written with so much feeling that you're willing to forget this. Now, what we're having is an intellectual class. There's a responsible class and a coalition between Caribbean free men, Black American free men. We had enough mobility until another Black American free man, a preacher, Garnett, was invited to come to Jamaica to rest up from the wars and the trials and tribulation in the United States. He came to Jamaica, and after a while someone let him know that condition in the United States had not changed. He thanked the Jamaican host and said that, I'm going back to the United States. Not to ask for justice, because I know I'm not going to get that. Not to ask for mercy. Not to ask for citizenship. I'm going back to the United States to devote the rest of my life to trying to tear that republic down. Black men don't speak that way anymore. They don't have this kind of a nerve anymore. So let the house come down. If I can't be a man in the house, let's burn it down. So you had then the beginning of the 19th century radical class, both in the West Indies and South America and in the United States. While this was our beginning in the harshness of slavery, it was our intellectual beginning. And the best that we can do today is to look back on these valiant men, both of the Caribbeans and the United States, and how well they cooperated, and how well they were aware of what was happening to our people in South America. And maybe if we learned something from them, we could address ourselves to a concept of unity today, and all of us, no matter where we are, will be an African people once more, and we will understand that the concept of Pan-Africanism would later start and will be brought to fruition mainly by three Trinidadians, H. Sylvester Williams, George Padmore, and C.L.R. James, still alive. What we need to understand about this early period before emancipation, the fact that we saw ourselves as a people and we understood something then that we don't understand now. That the slave ships brought no West Indians, brought no Black Americans, no high visibility people, no people confused about color, no people boasting about that Dutch uncle, nothing like that. Only African people. That all of us had to become what the nature of oppression made us become. Now we have to become once more an African people and join one to the other and understand that we are a major population in the world, and being integrated into our master's house is no solution, because we are being integrated into a dying house, being integrated into ourselves, claiming the prerogatives of African people all over the world is what we have to start seriously thinking about and start doing. That, of course, is tomorrow's work, and you always start tomorrow's work today. Thank you.